Welcome to this evening's Memorial Frank Archibald lecture. My name is Peter Anderson, and it's really a pleasure to be here. I am the new Pro-Vice-Chancellor Indigenous, so it's a real pleasure and treat to be able to introduce our speakers today and to welcome everybody here to the Arala Centre. Now, I would also like to acknowledge with us tonight is the Archibald family. We have Hazel Bale, Lynette Ahoy and Des Ahoy. And also I'd like to acknowledge the local Armidale community. It's really nice that you are here and also for myself to meet you all for the first time as well. I'd like to now introduce and welcome up here to do an acknowledgement to country Larissa Ahoy, who is the Cultural Engagement Officer here at Arala and great-great-granddaughter of Frank and Sarah Archibald. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Dangana o Tila. Yaka Larissa Ahoy. Yaka Apanga Colin Ahoy. Ua Irupela Barbara Ahoy. Ua Irupela Ethel De Silva. Nyala Kyunanga. Injinga Kyuna Anawan Nyaka Kyuna Wangaka. Inja Anawan Kyuna. Inja Nyambika Kyuna. Nyambika Urala. Ana Ndaka. Nyanga Ndaka Wangan. Ndaka Rakina Nyambika Kyunda. Nedima Ronyara Inja Kyunda. How are you all? My name is Larissa Ahoy. My father is Colin Ahoy. His mother is Barbara Ahoy, and her mother is Ethel De Silva. We come from this country, Anawan country. Let's all listen and learn from country. In today's welcome, I would especially like to acknowledge our neighbours from other parts of the tableland, the coast and the plains, but I'd also like to acknowledge especially our Gumbaynggirr neighbours, as that whose grandfather was. He was a proud and respected Gumbaynggirr man. He was also a clever man, an advocate for health, housing and education and Aboriginal land rights. I reckon that's where my dad Colin got it from when he protested against Pauline Hanson's speech in the Armidale Mall, to which he cancelled it and took off. I think Yvonne's theme today, or this evening, from protest to policy, it resonates with a lot of Aboriginal families, especially those who've grown up with it. I am one of them. I remember my father coming home frustrated a lot from all the meetings he attended, such as our Narwan group meetings. They were always awful, I can tell you that much. Our land council meetings. Dad used to follow Nan Ethel to all the meetings when he was young, so I guess that's where he got it from. I guess that's where I got it from. So after Nan, it was his responsibility to do so. He took it up with passion, pride and heartache. He protested in Tassie for the Franklin Dam. He walked the Sydney Harbour Bridge. He marched through Redfern. He turned his back on Howard. And he even ended up over South Australia protesting at Roxby Downs against the uranium mines. So I would like to welcome everybody here this evening, and I hope you enjoy this evening's lecture.
Thank you.
Thank you, Larissa. UNE's Frank Archibald Memorial Lecture has been part of the university's calendar since 1986 and is dedicated to Frank Archibald, his family and Aboriginal people of the New England region. Frank Archibald was renowned for his knowledge and interest in all issues affecting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, particularly education. The lecture is presented by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander speakers who are leading professionals in fields such as education, law, social justice, government and the arts. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Yvonne Weldon. Yvonne Weldon is an independent councillor and the first Aboriginal councillor in the city of Sydney, Sydney's 180-year history. She was born and raised in inner Sydney, but maintained strong ties to her Wiradjuri homelands of Cowra and the Riverina areas of New South Wales. She follows in the footsteps of a proud tradition of activists and change makers, including her great aunt Mum Shirl and her uncle Paul Coe, a prominent Aboriginal rights campaigner. Her family were instrumental in establishing the Aboriginal Children's Service, Aboriginal Medical Service and Aboriginal Legal Service in Redfern. So it gives me great pleasure to please welcome to the stage Yvonne Weldon.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Can you hear me? It's all good? This area has a long and rich cultural tradition, one that spans thousands of generations. And in more recent times, a history of struggle, of resilience, and of a community that has never stopped fighting for change. It's an honour to be here with you and to evoke that legacy. To begin, I would like to acknowledge the Anawan people whose lands that we meet on today. I extend my deepest respects to the elders, past and present. I also would like to extend and respect to the Gambanga, Dungari and Kamilaroi people who also make up our community, but also our lands connecting across all of the boundaries and all of the history. We have the strong and enduring connections in this area. I'd like to thank the Archibald family for inviting me to speak. I spent the afternoon with the members of the family and you have made me feel very special and very welcomed. Thank you to the University of New England and to the Wiradjuri Aboriginal Centre for hosting me. I would like to thank you, everyone that has gathered here this evening. You've made me very nervous, and it's an immense honour to be here with you. Learning about Uncle Frank Archibald, it is clear he was a man that's steeped strong in his culture that was taught and passed down from his elders, and with his wife Sarah passed down to their children, and certainly it continues to be passed down as we can see here today. A proud Gambanga man, Uncle Frank was renowned for his knowledge and interest in all issues affecting his people and all Aboriginal people, speaking up and fighting for his people, for culture and also for self-determination. I've really enjoyed hearing some of the stories from those that I've spoken to today and meeting with his family who have continued and will continue that legacy. This connection is a profound part of life, whether it be with the people of different nations or those that we share ties. As we know, you can bring a couple of Kuris or Guris or Murrays together and we'll soon discover that we have shared in-laws or outlaws. And we certainly know they're everywhere. It is in that spirit that I want to share some of my own family stories, and there are similarities in our stories, the challenges and also the suffering, but also the shared strength and wisdom of the elders like Frank and Sarah Archibald so clearly possessed. I have cherished the stories of my elders with my great-grandfather Paul Coe Sr., who was born around the same time as Uncle Frank. His descendants and all my grandparents, my great aunts and uncles, their spirits live on in all of us who carry out the traditions and our stories. I am a Wiradjuri woman, and Wiradjuri itself means the three rivers. the three rivers of the people, in reference to the three rivers that frame our beautiful country, that form our songlines. They are the Murrumbidgee, which my dad's people are from, the Clare, which later became known as the Lachlan, where my mum's peoples are from, and also the Wamble, which was renamed Macquarie. There's so much about spirit and that connection to your land, and everyone that is strong in their culture and their identity will continue to be connected to the spirits of the lands of their ancestors. And I certainly feel that here today with the ancestors that I've met of Uncle Frank and Auntie Sarah. There have been many things that have been renamed in this country, and certainly when I think about my mother's journey back in Cowra, she grew up on Arambi Mission with her parents, my grandparents, and all our elders. The government had forced my grandparents and their parents before them onto a mission which was later called, or known, and still known today as 32 acres, although we have more acres than 32. It was a time where Aboriginal people were counted. We weren't counted, we weren't really included in life as we know it today. We weren't considered in the ways that we should have been, that other people have been in this country. When my grandmother gave birth to my mum, it was actually in a segregated part of Cowra Hospital. That was an improvement from previously being denied of ever being allowed to be included in that hospital. Let that sink in. That's my mother. She was born in 1952, and yet down in Cowra, she wasn't allowed to be born into the other part of the hospital. It had to be in the segregated part for blacks only. I recall actually as a child going home to Cowra, where in the picture theatre, even though those rules had changed, it was still expected for us black kids to stay in the area where we were always told, blacks in the back. Our people were regarded with such disdain that they were barred or kept from other places where white Australians were allowed to access basic health care and other services. Life on the mission was harsh. Food was rationed and authorities held absolute power, making sustained efforts to suppress our culture. Child removal was prevalent at the time, and the lighter skinned kids like my mum were particularly at risk. I remember Mum telling me how on the mission one day she didn't go to school, and you had to get permission off the mission manager if you're allowed to stay home. And so they would come looking for these kids that weren't in places where they could be controlled or told where to be. And my mum had to stay in the chimney because they were looking for her to take her away. This was a regular routine on the mission. I recall my mum telling me about one of her cousins. It was actually one of the babies, and so my mum is the eldest of 5 girls, and they used to love all the babies that came along. And there was her cousin brother, and she remembers going to school, and they came home looking for baby, and baby was taken. They all looked after him, but they continued to look for him. She remembers that day, and she has never forgotten it. They tried for many years after the mission manager days were ended to try and find him. They did eventually find him. They found him after he died, and they took him home back to country in a wooden box. That baby was a lost baby, became a man to live amongst us, or rather live within institutions, to never be back with his country and his people in the living. On my dad's side, my grandmother moved around frequently. She would get seasonal work, and she was always trying to stay one step ahead of the Aboriginal Protection Board. Protecting, I don't know for who, but it certainly wasn't for them. They lived along many parts of the Murrumbidgee, but they eventually settled at Wattle Hill, a community dispossessed who built homes from sapling trees and materials from the local dump. Not unlike Uncle Frank and Auntie Sarah, who I read about how they moved around for different makeshift camps and stations. My grandparents' generation fought tirelessly to protect their children, ensuring they received an education and held on to their cultural heritage. My parents later, when they finished their schooling, met in a camp. They used to hold this sort of Aboriginal camp down in Sydney at Lane Cove, and I think maybe some of the people from up here were also down there in those days. And my parents met at Lane Cove and later fell in love and resettled in Sydney. That's where my parents raised me and my two younger sisters. My parents actually brought in 74 in a suburb in the inner west of Sydney called Dulwich, and they still live there today. But in fact, when my mum was the first company secretary of the Aboriginal Legal Service, and when my mum and dad wanted to buy a house, they'd lived in Mitchell Road, Alexandria and other parts of the inner west, but they wanted to settle down and have a home, which they still have today. But in actual fact, my mum and dad, when they'd try to go to real estate agents to look at houses, they would refuse them. And so my mum would go to the real estate agents, because my mum's fairer than my dad, and she would go with one of the legal services solicitors, and they would let them see houses. When my parents brought their house in 74, there was actually a petition in the street to stop these blacks from moving. They brought their home, and yet they still tried to block them from moving into the street. That was in the 70s. That's in my lifetime. It's in so many of yours. There was an old gentleman that lived on one side, and he was a returned soldier, old non-Aboriginal man, and on the other side of Mum and Dad, to this day, a couple, Chris and Eva, and Chris was involved with the Cypress Helene Club way back then, and so he came out to Australia. They were a Greek couple and were actively involved in their community. And when this petition hit Chris and Eva's, the couple said, "No, you go away. You know, we're welcome here. They should be welcome here. It's their country." They went next door to this returned soldier, and old Harry, his name was, lovely old man. And he said to him, "If you don't get off my porch, I'm going to shoot you." And so that's how my parents got to stay in their home without the opposition of some of these closed-minded, small-minded people. My mum, as I said, was involved in the struggle, and certainly at the Aboriginal Legal Service was certainly a struggle. And as the first company secretary, she worked alongside so many brilliant non-Aboriginal people that later went on to do amazing things in this country. But Redfern was home to many at the time, many of our people that left some of these areas because of the treatment, and particularly after what was happening with people being put onto reserves and missions and the treatment that continued within those country towns. Some of it still exists today. I'm not going to say that it's all, all been solved. But Redfern was home to many, and many people came to Redfern because they were drawn by the prospect of work at the railway yards, because our people often weren't included in many workplaces other than the railways or the wharves. So Aboriginal people travelled from across the state, and that's where communities had been formed. Following the 67 referendum and the subsequent closure of the missions and reserves, so many of our people flocked to the area, and there were sort of like little missions in and around Redfern. Despite the positive result of the referendum, racism persisted. Many in the community didn't see any true immediate change for them. The influx of migration led to overcrowding, and exacerbated existing problems like poverty and also unemployment. It was then that spurred my elders and others to act. One of those was my auntie, Mum Shirl, also known as Shirley Smith, but beautifully known. Auntie Shirley, she'll always be Auntie Shirley to me because she's actually my great-grandmother's younger sister. Auntie Shirley was at the forefront, and in fact, her alongside Uncle Paul and others was the front to lead so many others. Her activism began when she started visiting her brothers in prison. When visiting, she encountered many others, victims to a crooked justice system. I mean, there certainly wasn't any justice in it, that were in need of support. At times, she would be able to get a message out to the families because often the families didn't know where their people were taken to. So Auntie Shirley would find out and she'd make sure through her connections that the information was being passed on. She'd advocate and arrange for them to have access to essential supplies, books and musical instruments. She continued these visits even after her brother was released, offering support and encouragement to so many of them over the years. Her nickname became a habit of replying, I'm his mum, because they wouldn't allow strangers to visit. So she would often take the brunt of it to say, yeah, that's my boy, you know. So that's how she got the name Mum Shirl. She was the only woman in Australia to be given an unrestricted access to prisons in New South Wales. It was a gold pass, and I recall it very vividly, when Auntie Shirley could go into these jails and they couldn't deny her. And the authorities came to think of Auntie Shirley as some sort of welfare officer, I think, and they began to refer to her in this way. But she was, however, working in a voluntary basis, and she would go to any part of the state and often beyond. And she had very little, but whatever she had, she gave to others. She opened up her home to so many, particularly young single mothers and people who were homeless or others who had no family or friends in Sydney. She also took on the responsibility of caring for children in need and fostering over 60 children throughout her life. She'd advocate for them to get an education. In fact, it was only Shirley who was able to get me back into a high school because I was going down a very different path. Auntie Shirley stood up for so many. She didn't care what nationality you were, and she'd say, I don't care if you're black, white or brindle. If you needed support, she was there. And I remember going to her house sort of as a child, but also when I became a mum myself, and she still had her home open. No matter what she would get donated, she would always donate it to someone else. She never took anything for herself. Her compassion and simple belief is that you help others if you can, and there is always someone else worse off than you. She passed those lessons on to my mum's generation as well. Thinking about those that stood beside Auntie Shirley, and often Auntie Shirley was guiding, as I think about my Uncle Paul Coe. Uncle Paul arrived in Redfern as a teenager, a few years ahead of my parents, and Auntie Shirley had a watchful eye on him. I'm sure she shaped and inspired him. In fact, he looked up to her in ways that we all have. Uncle Paul went on to devote his life to the fight for justice, a visionary and leading voice in Aboriginal rights movement, and he was instrumental in establishing Redfern's groundbreaking Aboriginal organisations. It's hard speaking about him because we only just recently lost him, just over a month ago, and it leaves a very big void in our family and community, and we feel it profoundly. I wanted in part to dedicate this lecture in recognising and honouring him, and it's really interesting when I think about my life and the people in my life, and you know, my mum and my dad and Uncle Paul, Auntie Shirley and my grandparents and Aunt Isabel and Uncle Billy Craigie and so many others, is that when they just believed and they gave, you knew that you were a part not only of blood family, but of a family for all of us. As with Mum, Uncle Paul, he grew up on a Ramby mission, and he was the eldest of all the cousins. His parents, my auntie and uncle, challenged both the mission managers and also the school authorities, ensuring that he received an education. In fact, he became the first Aboriginal student at Cowra High School to be elected as a prefect and to complete his HSC. He was a gifted athlete and artist, and he moved to Sydney chasing his dreams. But racism was rife, and Uncle Paul had encountered many barriers. He eventually gave up on aspirations to play footy and to pursue his art. And in that time in Redfern, and of course elsewhere, police, discrimination and brutality was commonplace. The Aboriginal community was subject to racial abuse, harassment and forced detentions under a police-imposed curfew. This oppressive police targeting Aboriginal people with vague charges like police, public drunkenness, which allowed for arbitrary enforcement, and if you protested, police will often respond with violence. Those charged generally had no legal representation, forcing many to plead guilty. Amidst these injustices, Uncle Paul found friends among those that envisaged social and political change. A lot of them were students at university that were studying law, and they knew this was wrong. He was part of a core group of activists who started monitoring and recording police actions to deter harassment and unlawful arrests of Aboriginal people. These were self-determination in action. The critical work led to establishment of the Aboriginal Legal Service in 1970. The ALS provided free legal advice and representation to the community, handling hundreds, in fact I think it was over 550 cases in the first year alone. Aboriginal founded, governed and staffed, the ALS became a powerful symbol for self-determination. As Uncle Paul later reflected, it was more than a legal office, it was, and it is, the embodiment of a generation of Aboriginal people's desire to control their own destiny. The ALS preceded the establishment of government-funded legal aid and provided a model for community legal services across the country. It was truly groundbreaking. Mum recalls when they had the ALS up and running, and there was a group of more solicitors that wanted to make this more broadly. They spoke to ALS to see whether they could use that model to make sure that free legal aid was being offered to everyone. And this is the type of movement that takes place when you lead by Aboriginal people, you lead for everyone. Uncle Paul and his peers didn't stop there. A year later, they established the Aboriginal Medical Service. Inspired by the ALS, the AMS provided culturally safe space and healthcare. This was response to the systemic racism, neglect and poor health outcomes faced by Aboriginal people in the mainstream healthcare system. The establishment of these organisations spurred a nationwide network of similar services. In the following years, Uncle Paul also established a breakfast program for the local Aboriginal children, which evolved into Marawena Preschool, the first Aboriginal preschool in the country. It expanded to include more childcare services and other vital services. He also was involved in the Redfern Black Theatre site, which laid the foundation for a wellspring of creative expression within Sydney's Aboriginal community. But make no mistake, this was a revolution. Uncle Paul was at the vanguard of an ascent into Aboriginal rights movement. My mum and dad were a part of this movement, as was my auntie Coe, and I grew up amidst this hotbed of social and political change. I was a child of this revolution. But us kids, we were playing, keeping ourselves entertained whilst the elders would meet We were told to be seen and not heard, as I'm sure many of us remember that phrase. We may not have understood everything that they were talking about, but we were watching and we were taking it in. As a girl, I remember going to countless marches and protests. And for me, the biggest ones were always on A Day. That's what it was known back then. It was the precursor before NAIDOC. It was A Week, but we'd always march on A Day. And I remember all the cousins and people would come down from all across New South Wales, and different organisations would help support so that we could march to raise the awareness for our rights that were being denied in this country. The ALS would coordinate the marches alongside the AMS and the Aboriginal Children's Service, the Aboriginal Housing Company, and all the Aboriginal organisations in Redfern would come across the state because we would come together. There we were joining our voices together. We were joining us as people from all our different nations and our tribes and our clan groups as one big family to make sure that we were demanding justice, inequality and respect for all. At that time, there were many non-Aboriginal people who stood with us, particularly those that contributed to the formation and worked for the Aboriginal services. But on the other hand, there were bystanders and shopkeepers when we would come out, when we'd march along those streets that would hurl abuse at us, and others would stare and point. We'd set off from Redfern and march down to Town Hall in the city, and that's where the speeches were made. Even as a kid, I understood what they were doing, and it was a powerful act of defiance. This photo is of me at one of those rallies. That's my Uncle Paul addressing the people. And that's me, this little, I don't know why my parents let me out of the house that way, but anyway, this kid here on the left-hand side. And I don't know, I reckon I'm standing there thinking I'm the security guard or something, but I'm not sure whether I was understanding him, but I was trying to make sure that everyone else needed to understand him. And I think about what it must have been going through my mind, and certainly the changes that were being made just by people hearing what he had to say. Uncle Paul's activism extended far beyond Redfern. He helped coordinate a march down George Street supporting Vincent Lingiari's Wave Hill walk-off, and he supported and spoke about rallies against apartheid in South Africa and also the Vietnam War. Whilst supporting these causes, he also challenged those who were ready to protest racism overseas but were less concerned about the racism back here at home. On one such occasion, he delivered a blistering speech in which he challenged the protesters to also address Aboriginal oppression, lest they kill us with hypocrisy. In 1972, Uncle Paul joined with others who started the Aboriginal Tent Embassy in Canberra. While the oppositional leader, Gough Whitlam, visited and met with the group, the government of the day did not support them, and police tried to shut it down in a violent attack. Uncle Paul was one of those who was beaten and was hospitalised. The brutal response was fuelled by excessive fear of an Aboriginal uprising, which also led to an intense government surveillance with ASIO monitoring the activities of prominent activists. As Kevin Gilbert later put it, the government feared a voice that wouldn't tolerate the breadcrumbs that they were providing to Aboriginal people. Encouraged by his peers at the ALS, Uncle Paul had enrolled to study law at the University of New South Wales. He was the first Aboriginal person to do so, and later was admitted as one of Australia's first Aboriginal barristers. Practising law allowed Uncle Paul to be an advocate with the colonial structures he sought to change. But even as he took the courts, he never lost sight of the power of protest. He became a leading campaigner for land rights, for organising rallies and meeting with lawmakers to propose inclusions into what became the New South Wales Aboriginal Land Rights Act. Uncle Paul went on to launch a legal action against the Commonwealth in the High Court, arguing for recognition and the sovereignty of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Although it was unsuccessful, the case laid the foundation for the landmark Mabo judgment 10 years later. At one point, Uncle Paul's activisms took him to the United Kingdom, where him, along with a couple of friends, rowed a boat across the harbour at Dover Beach, to plant the Aboriginal flag, claiming the land for all Aboriginal people. He said if it was good enough for Cook, then it was good enough for us, what he declared at Dover. To an audience of supporters and onlookers, the peaceful invasion demonstrated the absurdity of Terry-Nulla's lie. He also spoke at the United Nations forums on a number of occasions, and he contributed to efforts to develop a framework for the rights of Indigenous people. As always, he used the platform to raise awareness on the world stage about the ongoing disadvantage experienced by First Nations Australians. People were very fearful of that. They didn't want it to be known. And maybe some people would say they still don't. In years later, Uncle Paul continued to advocate through teaching at Eora TAFE and at Sydney University. He gave his time willingly to all and inspired many students to engage with their culture, to think critically and to be proud of their Aboriginal heritage. If it wasn't for Uncle Paul and so many of my elders, I would not have had the opportunities that I have. It's amazing to see the changes that have happened in certain places, like even in universities. They didn't exist back in those days, and so some of these challenges that Uncle Paul and others did certainly shook the foundations to have people have a good hard look at themselves around what they are doing or what they are contributing to. It is the elders who have blazed the trails that we walk today. Those who had the belief and determination to change the course of history. I am proud to follow in their footsteps and to carry that torch. Over my life, I've worked in a range of government and non-government and Aboriginal community-controlled organisations, working across health and human services, disability services, childcare and child protection, housing and heritage. It hasn't always been easy. I've faced significant challenges, and at times it feels like I've been banging up my head against the wall. Nonetheless, I deeply value the opportunity to work in these positions to effect change. It is an opportunity that is simply not available to those that came before me. I always think about my elders that did it hard and the difference that they made and the difference they continue to make today. And they aren't recognised. There are so many of our people that have made a change in this country that will never be known. And it's such an important reflection of being here to produce hopefully a lecture in honour of Uncle in what he has been able to do. It's about that trailblazing that people don't realise that they're doing it, but they do it nonetheless to make the difference that be positive for everyone. I saw Mum and Uncle Paul involved in our local land councils when I was younger, and I would watch the rough, I think it was pretty rough, and the tumble part of that political space. And I tell you what, I swore black and blue I would never get involved in Aboriginal affairs, ever. It's just not worth it, to be completely honest. I just thought I could not do this, because why do you want to go up against the challenges? You've got challenges out there and you've got challenges in here as well. But I think the greatest challenge is within, and what difference do we get to make for so many after us. Through my work in government and through also with the Land Council, I've been offered opportunities to join boards, and I haven't quite learnt how to say no yet. And it's often hard because I feel like, not because I've got the answers, but rather I want to be able to share and also learn from the others that I sit alongside. I'm involved with organisations such as Domestic Violence New South Wales. I'm involved with far too many organisations, but I think that whatever we can do by sharing what we have, we can make a positive difference way beyond us. There was a time where I was approached to join the New South Wales Australia Day Council, which I'm sure you could appreciate. I'd be quite conflicted about, considering my family had always, and I was always alongside that, protesting about the truth in this country. But when I considered whether I should get involved, and even later when I ran for local government, I spoke to Uncle Paul and my parents and other uncles and aunties, and I sought their advice because I didn't know whether I was going to be able to make a difference or whether I should or whether I shouldn't. They, as I had always honoured them and always will continue to honour them even long after that they leave us, is about their advice is always going to be through a lens that I need to also look through. And when I spoke to my uncle, he said to me, get in there, don't throw rocks from afar, make sure that we're heard, get in the tent. Make sure that people hear us and make sure they see us. And I remember going and having a yarn with him about, having a feed with him and having a yarn with him about running for council, and he asked me, you know, what do you want to do it for? Do you think you can make change? And I said, well, I can only try. And he says, well, get in there and do it then. And so I did. Running for council wasn't something that I was setting out to do, but when I was approached to run as part of a team, I saw the value in having a seat at the table. And the message from my elders was the same: get in there and make sure our voices are heard. When I was first elected to council in 2021, I was elected as the first and the only Aboriginal councillor to be elected in the City of Sydney. And, you know, whereas this is like 40 odd years ago, I stood at the steps of Town Hall outside there. In actual fact, when I look out my office window, I actually see those steps, and it's never in my wildest dreams of this crazy-haired child did I ever think that I'd be inside those sandstone walls, because it was something that was never done. It was something that you never saw. And as the lone independent councillor, just 1 out of 10 votes on council. And again, there seems times when I felt like I've been banging my head up against those sandstone walls. But even just being at that table, I've seen the conversation shift. And if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And sadly, this has rung true for the Aboriginal community in Redfern, who have been displaced and marginalised. At its peak in the 70s, Redfern was home to an Aboriginal community of around 40,000 people. Devastatingly, as a result of government and their policy over the last few decades, there are only about 1,000 odd Aboriginal people remaining today. I ran for council to ensure that local government is representative, to give my people a voice, and to help all that have traditionally been excluded to find their voice and to influence change. And being here made me also reflect about with the country I'm on, and also some of the people that paved the way for me, even in local government. And I need to reflect and respect about Auntie Pat Dixon, who led the way. In fact, she was the first Aboriginal person in New South Wales to be elected into local government, and I could only imagine the hurdles and prejudices that she had faced. As she served here at Archibald as a councillor for 17 years, including 3 years as the Deputy Mayor, a strong advocate for the local community, Auntie Pat was also instrumental in increasing Aboriginal participation in local government. Her legacy continues through her family and all that she inspired, and through the Pat Dixon Memorial Scholarship, which supports people in local government and to undertake further study, professional development or research. And I was very proud to be grateful to be a recipient of that scholarship as a new councillor. Being a councillor has also afforded me a platform to represent and advocate for the local Aboriginal community. And the council is making substantial progress in a whole range of areas. This year alone, we've approved a handful of Aboriginal place names that have been and we've recently appointed an Aboriginal firm to lead a major project where we've committed to an Aboriginal creative and cultural space and dedicated land for an Aboriginal aged care facility. And we've allocated funding for an Aboriginal housing project. Meanwhile, we have a growing number of Aboriginal staff that we've rolled out cultural awareness training across the organisation. And this is some of the most impactful work that we are doing as a council. In all my roles in government, I've pushed for greater community services and care and for accountability of outcomes. One of those key things for me as a community representative is to bring people together and give an opportunity to share, to be heard and to hear others. While still conflicted, I'm really proud of the work that I do on the New South Wales Australia Day Council. In the years that I've been involved, this date is observed has completely shifted. From the morning ceremony to the evening concert, we lead the country in honouring the culture and the history of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I haven't shied away from my personal views that we should change the date, but I've simply said that whether we keep the date or whether we change it, we must acknowledge that all that has taken place, both the good and the bad. While Uncle Paul's generation marched and protested as they didn't have a seat at the table, they have made their own tables in the community-controlled organisations. These were the only avenues for change. I continue the change-making tradition through those roles that I have held on the new ground that their struggles have forged. But whilst much has changed, there is still much to be done. Well, it hasn't changed at all. In the start of last year, I took a role on at the helm of the New South Wales and ACT Stolen Generations Council, one of the 4 independent-run organisations providing support to Stolen Generations survivors, the descendants, and also the family members that weren't taken but also suffer as well. The other 3 organisations are named for Aboriginal specific homes such as Kinchela and Kuta and Bomaderry, and I struggle with those terms homes because there was nothing homely about those places. We support all of those who went through those institutions and also the mainstream ones too, and also the ones that were taken away and put into residences or set off to work, or were adopted or fostered. There is so much trauma, and I don't think any of us have the answers in terms of healing, but supporting those who need it is one thing that we can do. It is an honour to contribute to this vital mission, leading a small team in advocating for survivals and also their descendants, working to heal wounds that government policy created. Let's not forget that that was best practice in the day. What do we have today? 30 years on, only 5 of the Bringing Them Home report recommendations have been implemented in full. That's 5 out of 83. While the report has led to some positive changes, we must do so much more to address the ongoing trauma and distress of survivors and also the descendants and their family members. Not everyone was taken, but I'll tell you, I haven't met an Aboriginal person that wasn't impacted by these policies. In the wake of those who were taken and those that remain who were left with heartbreak and trauma, the broken families, despairing parents and communities, the daily fear, The national apology was significant in gesture, truth-telling and historical acceptance are key to the healing process. But it's the systemic reform behind the apology that is the most important part. And it strikes me that when we're having yarns with elders, the elders that we support, one of the most heartbreaking things for them is seeing history repeated. Many of us are now seeing their grandchildren removed or incarcerated. It's hard to believe, but assimilation policies were the best practice of that day. There are so many who actually thought that we had our best interests at heart. And I get it, it's all part of the journey. But don't think that we haven't changed too much along the way. The truth is our child protection systems are still failing our people. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children are 10 times more likely than non-Aboriginal kids to be removed from their families. And still, this is best practice of today. I often think about who's been held accountable. When I worked in youth justice, I would ask why. Why are we punishing the young person rather than all the adults that have failed them? We're going to take this child away or lock them up because their parents don't have the capacity to care for them. But that's also the direct result of the trauma that was inflicted upon them in their lifetime, and the disconnection from community and the dispossession of culture. It's not just parents, it's the teachers in the schools who suspend, then expel. It's the social workers, the police, the courts. It's the politicians and the media. We all have an obligation to support these kids, and we're failing. And still, in mainstream Australia, we're scared to speak about racism. It's easier to pretend it doesn't exist. If we don't talk about it, we can't address it. 2 decades in, we're failing in closing the gap. At present, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people die earlier than other Australians, experiencing a range of preventable health issues. Our children are removed from their families at greater rates than the stolen generations. An Aboriginal person in the Northern Territory is more likely to find themselves incarcerated than at a university graduation ceremony. I worked in youth justice for many years, and working with other strong advocates, we saw rates of youth incarceration in New South Wales start to drop. Devastating, that number is now increasing and approaching an all-time high. Of the 19 closing the gap measures, we're only meeting 5, and the ones we're failing are at the very worst: incarceration, child removals, suicide rates, and children's developmental milestones. Systemic racism persists, as do racist views held by some. I know people are frightened of this stuff, but imagine living it. For too long, Australian governments have made policies for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, not with them. As a result, the systemic disadvantage that we experience has endured. Despite the successes of Aboriginal organisations and the development of peak bodies, they have not been able to turn the tide and realise the outcomes which we all strive for. That's why it's important that we talk about the experience and the stories of our parents, our grandparents, and all of the generations. This inspires us to continue the struggle, to continue to carry the torch and keep our fires burning. And also because most Australians don't have a good understanding of our shared history because we don't share it. The Voice, for example, was built on a simple premise that we get better outcomes when we listen to people and empower communities. Now let me just say, and I've got to say this, I didn't support the Uluru Statement of the Heart. And people would say, what? I didn't support it because the consultations that took place was insulting to my elders, and culturally I couldn't support something that was disrespectful to them. But I did support a vote for the Voice. for constitutional recognition because it was going to be a start. And we haven't started anywhere. Where are we today? This representative body would have helped ensure government was both informed by and accountable to the representatives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. It would have served as a powerful platform to address the most urgent matters impacting our people. And I'm sure if more Australians had the better understanding of our shared history, in their hearts and in their minds and in their votes, we would have had a different outcome. But in requiring the assent of a majority of the population and opening up our rights for debate disempowered the First Nations people. In the spirit of the Redfern Revolution, we must take matters back into our own hands and continue to build our collective power. What that looks like to me is Aboriginal people knocking at the doors in all fields and all forums, stepping into positions and leadership and influence. In government, our people are working as advisors and policy makers, helping to shape laws and policies that reflect the needs and aspirations of our communities. In boardrooms, our people are rising to be directors and executives leading major corporations, bringing a unique and essential perspective to decision making. In the courtrooms, the number of Aboriginal lawyers, judges and magistrates is slowly growing, working to reform a system that has historically failed their communities. In the classrooms, we have First Nations educators and academics shaping the next generation, sharing knowledge and culture and creating inclusive learning environments. The work here at this centre, among others, is providing opportunities in education is that key. For many years now, this centre has helped forge a pathway for Aboriginal students, making higher education a reality for those who have faced significant barriers and creating a culturally safe and supportive environment for students to succeed. This is what leads to change. Knocking down doors and holding others in position of power accountable, harnessing our anger and achieving structural change. Despite the atrocities our communities have fought for basic rights, political inclusion and justice, we continue to do so, just as we continue to practice our culture. We look at our elders for inspiration, to Frank and Sarah Archibald, to Mum Shirl, to Paul Coe, to Anne and George Weldon, to Isabel Coe and Billy Craigie and so many others. We continue to walk in the path that they have forged, and they are with us. In our hearts and in spirit, they continue to guide us. We do our best to make them proud, and when we are doing our best for the generations to come. I'll leave you with a story about my grandkids, because now as a grandmother, everything I do it for them. I am very proud to be a mother, but if I could do it again, I'd just be a grandmother. I'm just putting that out there. My children take offence to that, but I don't really care. But when I was running for council, I had an amazing team that supported me. Just people from all walks of life said, yeah, I want to get involved. And I sort of, like, despite the protests, I didn't want to, it was so shameful, but they wanted to put all those posters up all over the place and have my face all over the streets, and it was just, you know, pretty hard to see, I can tell you. And it was a bit of a public nuisance if you ask me, but you have to do what you have to do to try and get there, I suppose. But my grandson, Tylen, when he was 2, he was going to daycare, and he's now in kindy. And the teachers were observing, like, the kids playing, and outside the picket fence there was one of my posters, and he said to his couple of his mates and said, "That's my nin. Yeah, that's my nin." And so for me, you know, what could be normal for him at 2 years of age, imagine what could be possible for him when he's 20. That's a change that we can create for him, his generation and all of your grandkids and great-grandkids. We need to make things better, supportive, more positive, because for too long we've had heartache, too much heartache. And I don't want to hand over to my grannies that pain. We've done that for far too long, and we all deserve so much more. Thank you, Yindamara.
Thank you so much, Yvonne, for that really moving lecture today, and a reminder that we walk behind our ancestors and for our grandchildren, and that our existence is resistance.
Yes.
So thank you so very much. I'd now like to open it up for questions. We have 2 roving mics here. So we have
Any questions?
Firstly, my name's Maria, but it's just a real privilege to even speak to you, so thank you very much. That was an extraordinary and very moving talk, and I've been to a few of these. But the thing that, I guess in my own experience, that troubles me immensely, and you did talk to it, is this out-of-home care and where our young people are now. And as somebody that's in the role of teaching our new generation of teachers, what do you think I and the people here can do to reduce, I guess, the subtle and the systemic racism that's in our schools, but also that's in the spaces that allow these children to be being removed? I mean, it just seems an awful thing to be doing, and that's about all I can say.
I think the systems exist to benefit the systems, you know. If you were to think about the cycle of change, we haven't changed anything. And when I was working within the systems, I was saying, like, what are you doing for early intervention and prevention? And they would look like I was speaking a different language. I was confused by that. But there is... Data is one thing, lived experience is another. And if I was to think about, often these kids have come from a flow and effect of broken connections, or people that were stolen and experienced some of the most awful treatments. How do you just resolve that if you actually don't deal with it? And like I've even had yarns over the years with people that have offer scholarships in schools. You know, sometimes they are taken away from their support systems of their community, and families support it because they want them to get the education. But then they go back to family and there's a disconnect there because they're growing and they haven't. You can't deal with it with one generation. Sometimes you might need to deal with multiple generations. But just concentrating on one generation without the others that have already been damaged, not because of their choices, but because of those systems that have affected them long before the systems that are affecting their children and potentially their grandchildren. Yeah. So if I was to say to you, and you're working in those systems, shake them and shake them well. Yeah. Otherwise you don't get any change.
I'm going to be one of those annoying people who make but a very quick statement rather than a question. I knew Mum Shirl very well, and I knew Paul slightly, and I'm sure a lot of other people that you knew or related with. Shirl was a force to be reckoned with, and I think you're the same.
Thank you.
Not as scary.
Yes, my voice isn't as loud as Annie Shirl is, I can tell you right now. Thank you.
Thank you. So we've got a question from a viewer online. Greetings from the unceded lands of the Kombumerri clan of the Yugambeh Nation. Thanks so much for making this available for those of us who cannot travel to UNE. How can we have a treaty like Victoria here in Queensland when the Liberal state government has scrapped the truth-telling inquiry?
Here in New South Wales, or is that Queensland? Look, you know, different parts of Australia have different parts to deal with, and you know, I think when I look at Victoria, they have very different systems in place. Smaller geographically and probably smaller in lots of other ways as well. If I was to look at, you know, the journey to treaty, the first impact here in New South Wales is very different to other parts of the country. And then if you look at some of those laws that have or potentially have not changed in some of those different jurisdictions, you can't compare the state with another state when you've got very different legislations in place, but also very different practices and certainly lots of other, you know, belief systems that isn't inclusive at all. It's sort of like comparing us to, you know, another continent and expecting us to do the same thing when, you know, even within our own First Nations communities, there's a lot more work that needs to get done amongst us, with us and for us before we can even have that conversation. So I don't have the answer to be able to resolve in any other state. It certainly hasn't even been, you know, there's sort of some conversations taking place here where we've got 3 treaty commissioners. But, you know, if I was to think about the referendum and where we're at as a country, I think that there's a long way to go. Long way to go.
What gives you hope?
Oh, my grandbabies, without a doubt. I think that, and you know what, I must say, being elected was one of that, and it wasn't because it was about that system of government. It was more about the people. The amount of people that stepped forward. I mean, I had no money, no idea. You know what I mean? And people just stepped forward. Like, we actually got elected during COVID. You know, we weren't allowed to. We had no money. Like, to do a mail out, I think for the election, it's going to cost us like $38,000 or something. I didn't have that, you know, like we didn't have that. And so we had innovation that took place. We had, we were allowed, I think in lockdown, we were allowed 1 hour of exercise outside, and so people took pamphlets and did a mail drop in as they were doing their exercise, you know, and we had people that we were doing talks online and getting interest online. And so, but people from so many different walks of life that were able to just contribute, because that was what this movement was about. You know, it's so humbling to see that there is so much goodwill out there, and I think if we not believe some of the loudest voices that often create the greatest harm, we can cut through all of that with that true hope of us coming together to have some of the, you know, the honest yarns that are uncomfortable. You know, I'm saying that even within our own communities and families at times. If we don't have those yarns, we don't ever change it, and it continues to fester. We are seeing parts of that in some parts of our country, unfortunately, but that isn't the greater part of our country and not the greater part of who we all be. And regardless of whether, you know, they're politicians of any nationality, regardless of whether they're First Nations or not, if they divide, that's the whole purpose of what they're trying to do. And I think for me, the greatest hope is how do we make it more inclusive? And the way that we do that is actually come together and share and be big enough and brave enough to say, well, you know, I don't have to agree with you, but I'm going to be kinder in what we do. And I think that's often the question that I ask myself in all of this work that I do, is that where's the kindness in it? And am I doing something today that there's going to need an apology tomorrow? And I don't want to be saying sorry, and I'm sick of people saying sorry to me and not making any change. Yeah.
Yeah, hello, how are you? So I started a company in 2017 and my own business, and it's really thriving. But one of the biggest things that's hurting a lot of black businesses around the state is a thing called black cladding.
Mm-hmm.
You know a lot about that, and I
Yes.
wonder if you dealt with that. And I'm just wondering how we can help this situation. I know it's in the policy as far as Supply Nation, and it's very hard, but it's actually robbing our people. I know a lot of the young businessmen along the coast and inland that actually lost their way, and they just can't keep up with their businesses, so they went back to, they give it in. But I know, like your family and my family, we strive, like we want our own dependence as far as self-sufficient and that too. So, but this year policy, it steals all that away from us. So have you dealt with that, or have you got a way of?
Well, I mean, there's lots of issues around black cladding, and I know that there's been some recent articles in the media around, particularly, you know, First Nations media around, you know, the people using and abusing the likes of Supply Nation and that recognition. Look, I think that, you know, when that was created in the day, that it's moved considerably since then. And I don't want to get into, and I hope I don't get a question around Aboriginality, because that's a whole different conversation, and preferably not online. But there is so much around this that I think that there are ways that locally we need to be able to do it, to be able to weed it out. And, you know, I think both federal, state and local governments needs to continue to engage locally and get communities engaged locally. There are, you know, across, I think in every jurisdiction, there's the Indigenous Chambers of Commerce that have also been addressing this stuff. And so that's also cutting through it. I'm not saying that it's foolproof, but I do think there needs to be more work to definitely address it, because one thing I always say is follow the money. If we know that money's not going back in community, we know they're not from community. I'm just putting that out there. Yeah, so let's talk about what that looks like, and if we've got people that certainly want to work with, you know, First Nations businesses, then actually start to prove what that looks like, because we know we live in it and we know who is benefiting from it, and it's not always us.
Hi, Yvonne. I was wondering, I think sometimes there can feel like there's progress and we sort of see certain milestones happening. But then even just sort of, you know, reading your bio and the statement of, like, in Sydney's 180-year history without a Indigenous councillor, that's both, like, encouraging and also, like disheartening. It's like, oh, wow, like,
It took that
how?
long. How come it took so long?
And how do you, I guess, how do you reconcile that, and also, like, being in that work environment? Because I'm sure a lot of people find themselves not quite at that level, but they're first in their organisation to be in some kind of role or whatever. Like, I don't know I don't know exactly what the question is, but can you speak to that a little bit?
I don't know what the question is neither, but I think that, look, you know, I know they say, oh, you can't be what you don't see, but I think, and as hard as it is, you know, there's so much. Like, I sit in there and I think, oh, it's so painful to do this stuff, you know, because I know I'm up against it. I'm the only independent on council. So you've got all these political parties that have all of this money that I don't have. And so being there is a statement within itself for them, if not for me, but for them, because they know they've got all of this money and I still got there with none of it, you know, and I don't have these organised systems that they've benefited from, you know, for decades, and so that speaks volumes as well. And so, you know, I've had a few wins, I must say. Like, the first time I was on council, it was the most painful thing because I was so frustrated because I'm not into politics. I'm actually into just make sure that community's heard. If you make it about you, then you make it about you, and it's actually about the people that I'm there to represent. And I even represent the people that didn't vote for me, you know, because that's what it's about. It's about community. Who are we, you know, and who are we weeding out of our community? And so if we continue to think that those that have the money and the power, that they're more important with those people that don't, then we've lost the whole point of why we should be there in the first place. And so I think that, you know, although it's a major feat to get there, it's an indictment. It's taken so long, but it also means that, you know, there is change. There is change happening, whether it's slow. You know, there was something I must say at council a couple of months ago. There's on Redfern Street next door to the AMS. There's this facility right next door. It actually. It was an non-Aboriginal organisation, like a non-profit group that held it, and everyone in the community will always ask about it. When can Aboriginal people, you know, get access to this place? When can we, you know, it's right next door to the AMS, it's historical, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, for years they kept saying, when is the lease up? When can we bid for it? Blah, blah, blah. Anyway, the organisation that had it sort of had moved out. They sort of wound up the organisation, and one of the councillors didn't, mind you, again, this is what happens on council. I'm the only Aboriginal councillor. They don't speak to me about Aboriginal stuff for some reason. I don't know. Maybe I might know something about it, but apparently I don't. They know more. And so they put a notice of motion up to go and to consult with the community to see what the Aboriginal community thinks about what should happen at that facility. Mind you, the community's been calling out for years they want the facility. And so I amended it to say, no, don't consult, put an EOI out. You've already been told what the needs are, address the needs. Mind you, the Lord Mayor and her team amended that motion to delete every word Aboriginal out of it. No word of lie. You can see it online. You can watch you can even listen to my comments online. It ended up getting pulled because it was going to be quite controversial, you think, you know? Delete every Aboriginal word out of a document. What does that say? In Redfern Street, in Redfern, next door to the first Aboriginal medical service in the country. And we're going to delete every Aboriginal word out of it. We don't want it to be an Aboriginal service. So at the very next meeting, there was so much agreement because there was clearly a lot of backlash from the community, and there was so much agreement that it now became my motion and it was fully supported. That's painful change, but it's change in a very different way. It may not be protesting, but it certainly is movement and change happening, whether it be around that table or in our communities, and we have to keep doing it.
Yvonne, this is another question from one of our online participants. So they say, I'm from Armidale and a descendant from grandfather and grandmother Archibald. My mother and her sisters were stolen generations. My grandfather was an Aboriginal activist in Melbourne for our rights. I currently work in a Mums and Bubs program, and I always feel conflicted that I'm a mandatory reporter. I want the best for our mums and bubs and want to see them thrive. Do you have any advice on how to deal with DCJ and be supportive of our families?
Jeez, don't give me an easy one, do you? I think, look, I have my issues with departments that continue to thrive for themselves and not for the very families that they are meant to be there and servicing. I've seen people that have worked their way up the line at the expense of our people. They get off on our misery. It's the truth. And if people are insulted by that, imagine living it. I've seen so much of people that will pull out the stolen generation survivors and cry at their stories and then go back to their desks and do the exact same thing. And yet, who's responsible? There is no accountability for those people in those departments. They're often, when you are an Aboriginal person working in those departments, you get it every single direction because one, it's your people, and two, you'll be blamed by your people as well. And if you don't honour the bureaucracy, you actually get it from them. One of the things I used to say, and I still believe in it, you know, I worked in state government and I've worked in federal and local government. You know, I was never a bureaucrat, never a bureaucrat. I was a public servant. I was there to serve the public. And if the bureaucracy was challenged by that, then they should be, because that's what they're paid for. I went to a meeting with I went with the elders, with the Stolen Generations organisation that I work for and the other three. And I'll never forget, we get funded one position from DCJ, one position. And it's a program coordinator, so that if we have any of our survivors or the descendants come in that they need help, it could be with housing or with their grandchildren being removed or whatever, that we support them. And so we get funded for this one position. So 4 organisations get funded for one position each, so 4 positions. And we had, I don't know, 5 or 6 of these bureaucrats sitting there, some of them Aboriginal, and they earned more money than all our organisations added together. And all I'm saying to them, how about you give me the money that you earn and I'll show you what I can do. And they look at you as like, we're doing important work here, but yet we're the ones doing the work for them. So the accountability is always back to us. It's like our kids. If you remove our kids, and I used to say it within the department, so clearly I don't work there anymore because they don't like me, but that's all right. But if you remove a child, and they're on this pathway, and you know that they're going in and out of placement, and then you know that they're going to eventually, by the time they're a teenager, not be in placement and be likely to be homeless or couch surfing. You've got workers that will say, we don't need to place them because we can't place them. We know they're going to be locked up in detention soon. Well, I hate the word detention, but it's a jail, it's a kids' jail. Then we know where they're going to be, so they're going to be managed. And I've heard workers say this. So then when they finish there, they'll go to the big houses and we know how much that costs. Just think about every one of the salaries of every one of those people along the way. How many millions of dollars was that? If you remove a child, if you lock up a child from, you know, being bail refused with some other kids, that child is going to be locked up in the local police station, so the local youth detention service is going to come and pick them up. So they're going to be 2-3 staff members. So you've got 2-3 at the jail, at the police station. Then you're going to have 2-3 from the detention centre come over, and then they're going to transport them back, and they're going to be checked in, and there's going to be like 3 or 4 there, and then they're going to stay there, and then they're going to be 3 or 4 the next day, or maybe 5 or 6, and then maybe the next day or the day after they'll go to court. Think about every dollar that was spent on that child being locked up for less than 48 hours. How about you give that child that money? Imagine the life they could live. Imagine the schools they could attend. Imagine the houses they could live in. Imagine the opportunities that they will have. But you know what? Every single part of that bureaucracy continues to grow and continues to benefit at the misery of that child and everyone in that child's family. Who benefits the most? Not us.
thank you, everybody, for some really hard-hitting conversations and some real truth there. So I really thank you for, giving me food for thought in the work that I do.